and let everybody in. Good afternoon. I am Gabriel Pellegrino, one of the librarians in the Local History and Genealogy Division of the Rochester Public Library. Welcome to the first in our Women's Suffrage series, marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, granting women the right to vote. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Thomas Lappas, who is chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Nazareth College. Dr. Lappas teaches courses in American colonial history, the American Revolution, Native American history, history of alcohol and temperance. Earlier this year, we saw the release of his book, In League Against King Alcohol, Native American Women and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, 1874 to 1933. Today's talk will discuss the strong connection between the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois women, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union as they fought for the dual goals of women's suffrage and prohibition of alcohol in Indian country and across the nation. And welcome, Dr. Lappas, and I am turning the reins over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gabriel. And I want to thank Gabriel Pellegrino and Brandon Fess for inviting me to the library to do this talk today. This is the first time I've done a public presentation using Zoom, so I hope everything works out okay. And if you have questions or anything, or if there's any problems, use the chat box before we get to the Q&A. Normally I interact with the audience a little bit more, but today I'm going to kind of go through the talk and then at the end hopefully save plenty of time for comments, questions, and answers, hopefully. All right, so first of all, I want to introduce myself a little bit and some limitations to the topic here. So why am I even here giving a talk on temperance and suffrage? Well, as Gabriel pointed out, I wrote a book. The book, In League Against King Alcohol, deals with Native American women and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So this talk is going to be heavily stilted towards the WCTU. And there's good reason for that. It was the largest women's organization in the United States up until the 1960s. It was bigger than any of the individual suffrage organizations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So it was a huge political force, social force to reckon with at the turn of the 20th century. And I want to provide some definitions and kind of maybe a little bit more about why temperance and suffrage are even linked together. So first of all, by the time period we're talking about, the 1880s to the 1920s, temperance, which at one point, that is earlier in the 19th century, temperance had meant being temperate with alcohol. So not drinking hard liquor, drinking cider and beer was okay. And it generally didn't mean political prohibition, legal prohibition of alcohol. However, by the end of the 19th century, the temperance organizations, and certainly the Women's Christian Temperance Union, were advocating absolute total prohibition. And so the term had evolved. And then the other term, suffrage, which more of you are probably familiar with, simply means the right to vote. And obviously we're celebrating, commemorating the struggle and the victory of women's right to vote. But suffrage for Native Americans was also a difficult and was a difficult road. And there were a lot of limitations to Native American voting that we're going to talk about today too. So suffrage in today's talk really involves both women's suffrage and Native American suffrage. And the WCTU was in favor strongly of both. Women's right to vote was something that was near and dear to them, and they thought that if women had the right to vote, they would get their goal of prohibition passed that much more rapidly. Generally speaking, they were also supportive of, at least in a big picture way, of Native American citizenship and ultimately voting, but we're also going to talk about some limitations to that overall goal. Now, a lot of people today, now not historians or those people who are kind of deep into the subject, but I find a lot of the average person, my students sometimes, some of my friends always wonder, why is temperance a women's rights issue? I'm a feminist today and I drink wine, what's the big deal? Well, we have to dial ourselves back to what was going on in the 1880s to 1920s and recognize that for the average woman in the United States, whether they were middle class, working class, upper class, most women were dependent upon their husband's property, whether it was their wages or the landed property that they had. Women had been struggling, and of course in the early feminist movement, one of the first sets of accomplishments was married women being able to maintain or retain some of their property rights. But 1880s to 1920s, in the average kind of married life of a couple, the woman was dependent upon the husband's wages. And the way I like to put this is this way. My wife's a teacher. I'm a teacher at college. We both have an income. And if I decide to go out and spend my entire paycheck on booze, I could do that. And my wife would be able to probably pay the mortgage and put food on the table, and certainly there would be some constraints, but she would be able to kind of continue living. At the turn of the century, if a woman was dependent upon a husband's wages and that guy went out and got drunk every night, and not only did he blow his paycheck, but also became ineffective at work and got fired, it was very rapid. It was a very rapid descent into homelessness, or certainly a precarious living situation, starvation, maybe even being forced into prostitution. So women's rights, or temperance itself, was a women's issue because the lack of it, or the use of drinking, or the excesses of drinking at the time, were such that women were very vulnerable. And of course, then there's the issue of domestic abuse, that domestic abuse was exacerbated by men's drinking at home. So that's a little background to kind of why this was such an important issue for women of every background in the 19th century. And let's turn things to the next slide here. All right. There we go. Okay, so I don't want to say it's the last plug for the book, so I'll shamelessly plug it throughout because there's some interesting stories in there. But what I'm going to do today is kind of pare down some of the kind of key figures of that whole story to two particular women. And because we're in New York State and we're in the area of the Haudenosaunee, and in particular this is Seneca territory, we're going to be talking about a woman who lived at the time on the Seneca Reservation, the Allegheny Reservation in southwestern New York. And then we're going to be talking about an Onondaga woman who lived on the Onondaga Nation south of Syracuse. So we're looking at two Haudenosaunee women. And I'm going to talk a great deal about both of them today, but I want to give you a little introduction to them. And for those of you who are outside of New York State, or those of you who don't know much about the Haudenosaunee, this will kind of give you a little introduction to that as well. So the first woman, we're going to discuss these in reverse order as the presentation goes on, but the one on the left of the screen is Lydia Pierce. Now, she is an Onondaga woman who lived on the Allegheny Seneca Reservation. So at some point, her family had moved from Onondaga country down to the Allegheny Seneca Reservation, right on the Pennsylvania border. And that's Lydia Pierce over here on the left. The other woman is Eliza Pierce, who is an Onondaga woman also, and she lived on the Onondaga Nation south of Syracuse. And for those of you who aren't familiar with these terms Haudenosaunee and Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee is the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois name for the confederacy of several distinct tribes that came together in the distant past into a league, a political league. And from the west to the east, these are the Senecas, Cayugas, Onondagas, Oneidas, and Mohawk. In the early 1700s, a sixth group came up from the Carolinas, and that was the Tuscarora. By the time we're in the 1880s, what we think of today as the current reservations in New York State were pretty much in their modern locations. So the Tuscarora, who were migrated in the early 18th century, their reservation, which is located near Niagara Falls, was essentially in place. And so the Tuscarora are going to become part of this story too. So these two leaders, are going to be involved in the Women's Christian Temperance Union at official levels, in kind of organizational levels, and then in some more kind of informal levels as well. Okay. Introduction to the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now, this woman who's over here on the right, this is Frances Willard, and she is not a Native American woman, although her family origins are actually in New York State, but she spent most of her time in Evanston, Illinois, which is a Tony suburb of Chicago today, where Northwestern University is. And a little bit about the WCTU, because this is going to kind of inform how Native American women were going to be involved in the organization. So the WCTU was founded in 1874, and the first president was a woman named Annie Wittenmeyer, who was conservative in the sense that she wanted the WCTU to just focus on temperance issues, not get involved in suffrage, not get involved in other reforms that were emerging at the time. And so it remained a fairly limited organization from 74 to 79. In 1879, Frances Willard becomes president, and she lasts as president until 1898, when she passes away. And Frances Willard is really up there in the upper echelon of kind of American women political leaders, social political leaders in the late 19th century. She had a running dialogue with Susan B. Anthony, or exchange, I should say, with Susan B. Anthony. They were politically a little different, but they had a fairly good, productive dialogue about their differences. But Willard, like Susan B. Anthony, was kind of a ball of energy and did a tremendous amount of traveling. And she's also a woman, I like to call her the woman of many mottos. So during her presidency, she had a bunch of mottos, and then she acted upon these, and the organization acted upon them. And one of the first mottos was agitate, educate, legislate. That is, this is what the WCTU should be doing. It should be agitating for temperance. And what this meant was engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, what we would call nonviolent civil disobedience. The WCTU got to start doing pray-ins. They would actually go into a bar and begin praying, or they would pray right outside the bar on their knees, and nothing's more of a buzzkill than a group of people praying for your souls as you're walking in to go get debauched, or to debauch yourself. So that kind of activity was one of the things that they engaged in. But it also meant kind of upper echelon political agitation also. They were very active. She was active, and she promoted active letter writing campaigns to all kinds of government officials, not just elected officials like senators and congressmen, and not just local legislators and governors, but also secretaries of the Department of the Interior, Secretary of the Navy, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. So anybody who was in a position to kind of enact an anti-alcohol policy, they were on. Well, I wouldn't say they're not on the phone, but they were on the paper. They were writing. Other motto was home protection. And this was a way that the WCTU tied into what were considered acceptable roles for women in the social milieu at the time. So home protection meant that women had a responsibility, and even conservative people who were opposed to suffrage recognized and accepted that women had a responsibility to protect the home. That was their primary role. And so therefore, they actually had a responsibility to speak out publicly about alcohol, because it was something that threatened the safety of the home and the peace of the home. And so home protection then became kind of rolled into a kind of nationalistic policy around the time of World War I. And home protection also meant protection of the United States from unwanted immigrant groups. And this, of course, was one of the driving factors to prohibition itself, is that there was an influx of immigrants from German countries, Southern Europe at the time, Eastern Europe, who brought with them their alcohol cultures as well as other social problems, and that home protection was kind of turned into a nativistic sense too. And then the other motto, which if you're you need a motto and you don't know what to choose, this was the other one: do everything. Now, what she meant by this was the WCTU should be involved in any project, any social movement that might also help the temperance effort or the prohibition effort. So the first one was obviously suffrage. So of course the WCTU needed to promote women's suffrage, because if women got the right to vote, they would be able to sway elections towards prohibition candidates. Certainly women should be involved in the anti-child labor movement, because if you don't have little kids working alongside grown men in the factories, they're not going to be exposed to alcohol, rough talk, all those kinds of things. So you'd be protecting the home that way. Of course, the WCTU should be involved in Native American policy, because the more they can do that, the more they could help stop the scourge of alcohol that was invading Indian communities. So do everything to her really meant do anything and everything that got you connected or helped this temperance movement out in the big picture. And so they really did. They not only are they advocates for suffrage, but the WCTU created departments every year. At their national convention, they would create new departments, get rid of old ones. At the state level, state WCTUs had their own organizational structure. The state WCTU unions would create departments of their own. So you'd get departments like the anti-cigarette smoking department, the Department of Christian Citizenship. You'd get the Department of Work Among Lumbermen, the Department of Work Among Indians. And so these departments then kind of were tasked with focusing on that specific thing within the do everything agenda. So the WCTU is going to create and abolish the Work Among Indians Department throughout really beginning in 1879 and continuing through about 1916. And that's really kind of a heavy part of the story of the book, is the internal organizational disputes about why they create one, get rid of one, combine it with other departments, etc. So some of the other things they do, we talked a little bit about how they engaged in politics. Native American women, white women who were disenfranchised, they were still political actors. So even though suffrage was kind of the key goal, that didn't mean that without suffrage they couldn't act politically. Like I said, they were influential on, many of them were tied to political candidates or prominent men. And so if a congressperson or a secretary of the Interior or the secretary of the Navy received a letter from a prominent woman, they would listen, because they knew that there might be political ramifications for not listening. And they were successful. That is, they persuaded people just simply with the force of their arguments at times. They were involved in pledge campaigns, so they got individuals. One of their big things was to get individuals to sign a pledge to abstain from drinking. That's one of the kinds of activities they did. And then a big thing, and this is going to play into kind of how this works in Native American communities, and I think if I have, one of the theses of my books is, Native American women really latched on to the Loyal Temperance Legions because they did something important in their communities that actually resembled some traditional activities. So what Loyal Temperance Legions were, as it might sound, Loyal Temperance Legion might sound like militaristic, and that's literally what they were. They were little kids' military societies, if you will. And originally they started out, the kids would march, and they'd have like fake guns and stuff, and they'd march in formation. And ultimately they dropped that because there were a lot of pacifists in the WCTU, and they said, okay, this is, that's a bad idea to be marching around with guns. So they shifted, and the program became primarily about giving speeches. And so the kids would develop oratorical skills. Now, girls who were in the organization, when they became majority age, 18 to 21, they would graduate into basically the junior WCTU. There was another level called the Young Women's Branch. And so the women would graduate, the young girls, once they became women, would graduate into that, ultimately become part of the WCTU. The WCTU excluded men from full membership. And so the boys, once they reached majority age, they were no longer in the WCTU. But the thing that boys could do when they graduated from the Loyal Temperance Legion is they could go into real politics. That is, they could run for office, they could vote, and the idea was is that what you were doing in these is inculcating in children these values of temperance and prohibition. And the girls would go on to continue down the road of home protection, agitating, educating, and legislating. But those boys who became men, they would be able to vote. They may even hold office, and then they're going to vote the right way for prohibition and for women's suffrage also. So this was a very important part of the WCTU all around, but it's going to become particularly important to Native Americans. All right. Now, getting into Native American history in the 1880s to 1920s, I want to provide a little bit of kind of background here so if people understand kind of what was at stake. And some of these, if anybody's been paying attention to the news and the McGirt decision, some of this stuff might ring a bell. And if you haven't, I encourage you to go take a look at the McGirt decision and some potential ramifications for the state of Oklahoma today. So 1880s to 1920s, generally speaking, tribal governments and the tribes are subject to federal jurisdiction, and they're subject to a federal ban on alcohol. So that is, almost all Native people at this time live on a reservation, and those reservations have a boundary around them, and federal law prohibits the sale of alcohol to Native Americans on those reservations. So generally speaking, that is the case. And the WCTU, as you might imagine, think this is a good thing. Now, one of the things that they're very interested in is enforcement, because that's one of the problems, is that the boundaries between reservations and the broader white community that live outside is very porous. Native Americans are excluded from citizenship, and this is cemented in a Supreme Court decision, Elk versus Wilkins in 1884. So the bottom line is that Native Americans are not subject to 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, the post-Civil War amendments that grant African Americans citizenship on paper and voting rights, etc. Those do not apply to Native Americans, and that's confirmed in Elk versus Wilkins. Now, there are pathways to citizenship that Native Americans have, and this brings us to the discussion of allotment. Now, some of you, this might ring a bell for those of you who took high school social studies in your American history class. Certainly, if you took Native American history 2 with me, you know this stuff. But allotment, what that did was many people in the federal government thought that, you know what, Native Americans living on a reservation that act as these kind of autonomous nations, this is really stifling Native American development. So from the most benevolent perspective, what allotment was an attempt to break up tribally held, tribally owned land into individual plots of land where individual Indian people would get that plot of land and hold the title to that land. That is, they become landowners. And this was a way of assimilating Native American people into the broader white society and the broader American economy. And there were some benevolent people who said this is a good thing because what you're doing, these people will become independent farmers. There won't need to be any kind of special laws for them. They can become citizens. This was the pathway to full inclusion in the United States. The fact of the matter is that this allotment policy, what it really did was a couple individual Native American people would become landowners and hold on to that land for a long time and become successful farmers. However, in general, what happened was Native American people who took their allotments, they often became desperate and had to sell those allotments to whites who were chomping at the bit to get at Native American land. So the purpose behind, or the intent behind allotment was really twofold. There were some benevolent people who saw this as an assimilationist effort that would bring people into the United States in full equality. Some people were simply hungry for Native American land, but the impact of allotment in general is roundly criticized by Native Americans and historians, scholars who look at this, because what it really does is it breaks up tribal communities, it breaks up tribal cohesion, and ultimately it disenfranchises Native Americans more than it ever provided for an economic benefit. However, in allotment acts, and there's two important ones we're going to mention briefly. If an individual and this obviously meant a man at the time, if an individual Native American acquired a plot of land, became successful enough that he was independent and didn't require any federal assistance, if that person then renounced his tribal affiliation, so instead of being Creek or Choctaw or Lakota, you pledge allegiance to the state of South Dakota and the United States, you could become a citizen. But that citizenship was approved or not, or your competence rather, that is the idea that you were independent, was approved or not by an Indian agent. So there was a pathway to citizenship and voting, but it required giving up part of your identity. It involved participating in the breakup of the political unit of the tribe, and it didn't happen that often. So there's two big acts. There's the Dawes Act, which most of you have heard of. That happens in 1887. It happens pretty much in the western part of the United States. Most of the Iroquois people are excluded from it. The Senecas are excluded from it. The Curtis Act is one that applies to the 5 big tribes of Indian Territory: the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Creeks, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles. And if you've been watching anything about the McGirt decision, the breakup of the tribes associated with the Curtis Act and the attack on the Creek government that occurred in the years after that as Oklahoma marched towards statehood in 1907, the question of whether the Creek reservation was disestablished or not is at the center of that case, and that's really kind of what's going on here. So this map over here on the right is actually a map of the Creek Nation as it was subject to allotment. So this is a segment of eastern Oklahoma, and actually the town of Tulsa is right there, is right around there if you can see it. This orange section here, though, these are allotments that individuals were taking, and you can see what you're witnessing there is kind of the allotment of those to individuals and the breakup of tribal cohesion, or at least political cohesion, as individuals took those plots of land. So the allotment issue is going on at the exact same time that the WCTU is kind of rising in prominence. And the WCTU and Native American women in it take a position. Some Native women are going to use the WCTU to promote allotment. Some people are going to use the WCTU to resist allotment. But all Native women in the WCTU are going to attempt to affect, shape, resist, or promote allotment through the political connections that the Women's Christian Temperance Union offered them. Okay. So this brings us to Eliza Pierce, and the first one of the reasons why I put Eliza Pierce here first is because I discovered her, not that I discovered her, but she already existed, but I came across her first when I started learning about Native American women in the WCTU. Eliza Pierce was one of the first people I came across. And there was a biography of her. In 1901, the Syracuse Herald newspaper wrote a long feature about her, and it stated that she was the first Native American woman to found a women's Christian temperance union, and she founded it in early 1901. And her background is an interesting one. By 1901 she had gotten a divorce from a husband who had probably been abusive to her. There's other stories about her in the newspaper that seems to suggest that her first husband wasn't the nicest guy. And she got remarried to a guy named Jairus Pierce, who was actually from Cattaraugus, which is a Seneca reservation in western New York. And he had moved to Onondaga, and they got married. And he had a first wife also. His first wife actually came out to Onondaga and got into physical altercations with Eliza. So she was very sensitive to Native Americans from New York State who weren't Onondaga, who were coming onto the Onondaga Nation and causing trouble. She herself identified as being a Christian. She went back and forth between denominations, but for most of her life, and certain key moments At this stage, she was mostly affiliated with the Methodist Episcopal Church on Onondaga. And she had children who helped to make up the membership in the WCTU, children, grandchildren, nieces, who had all gone to boarding school. One went to the Lincoln, or some went to the Lincoln Institute in Philadelphia, and some went to the Hampton Institute in Virginia, which we generally associate with being for African Americans. It was a historically black college, ultimately a historically black college. But for a long period of time, they accepted Native Americans as well. And so she had children who went there. And so she started the WCTU, and she seems to be the founder, and she dubbed it the Hiawatha WCTU, which of course refers to one of the key figures in the Haudenosaunee story of how the Iroquois League, or the Haudenosaunee itself, came together. And part of it had this individual, Hiawatha, who had suffered a good deal because of conflict among the different Iroquois nations that eventually came together to form the league. So she named it after him. But at the same time, she identified very strongly as a Christian, and she was very much a supporter, or at least on paper, a supporter of white style education, and encouraged her children to go to boarding schools. Now, obviously, the boarding school issue is another one, is a complicated one, and I talk a great deal about that in chapter 6 of my book. And certainly there was a huge coercive effort, huge coercive element of Native American boarding schools. But one of the things that did happen is that some Native people saw it as the best of a variety of difficult decisions or difficult choices. And she was someone who saw education as a route to success. And obviously there are people that didn't see that and saw the trauma that occurred from it. And even people who supported it later on came to recognize how traumatic the experience could be. But nonetheless, she's someone who brings in, or she participates in, these kind of acculturation efforts, while at the same time maintaining some elements of tradition as she brings in her oral tradition into the very name of the organization. I want to talk a little bit more about kind of how she uses the WCTU politically, and some of this is going to be a little bit kind of skimming the surface of some thorny legal issues that occurs here. But the gist of it is this, is that on the Onondaga Nation, as happens on many Native Indian reservations, there's a lot of movement. People from the tribe itself, or the original tribe, or the original confederacies, were often broken up into reservations, and people had family connections in other places. And so it was very common on Onondaga for people to kind of come and visit, to move to Onondaga because they thought there might be better prospects there. And so not only was she subject to the fist fights that she had with her second husband's ex-wife, but she also had problems with young Native American men who were coming from other reservations. Particularly in the feature about her, she talks about young Oneida men and young Mohawk men coming onto the Onondaga Nation and corrupting the good Onondaga kids that were there. And in order to stop this, she didn't really have a good political recourse, because the federal government, and actually in New York State took on, arguably illegally, some of these responsibilities. There was state and federal protection for whites, or against whites going on to the reservation, but they weren't really getting involved, and they weren't really interested in getting involved in other Native American tribes, tribal members coming onto reservations. So she appealed to the governor, who had a conversation with the Indian agent responsible for Onondaga, and they didn't do anything. So one of the things she did is she appealed to the WCTU in Syracuse, because there were politically connected white women who would be able to try to influence things. Now, it doesn't work out for her. The appeals that she attempts to make doesn't work. But it's interesting because one of the things that she's doing is not only is she seeing alcohol as a problem, so is trying to educate the youth using the educate part of that motto. But she's also trying to agitate here. That is, agitate for enforcement of alcohol laws or other laws that she sees as being protective. Now, there's another case, and I'm just going to mention this briefly for people who might be really interested in this. There's a case that she gets involved in a little later in life, where her brother dies, and according to Haudenosaunee matriarchal traditions and laws, the property of a dead man reverts not to his wife, but actually to his mother's clan line. And this is a key part of Haudenosaunee matriarchy, is that the women who are the clan mothers, when they have children, the children are part of the woman's clan rather than the man's family. And so in this system, the wealth that a man has doesn't go to his children. It actually goes to his mother's family. And if the mother's gone, that means the women in that clan line, which means his sisters. And so Eliza Pierce is actually going to sue in New York State court, or actually, I'm sorry, the wife of her brother is going to sue in New York State court to try and get the property back that Eliza Pierce took and redistributed. And Eliza Pierce is actually going to defend the Haudenosaunee matriarchal system of inheritance in New York State court, and she's going to win. And so the courts are generally not side with, they generally don't side with Native Americans, but this is a case in New York State where they maintained or reasserted some tribal traditions. And what I think is fascinating about this is that like many of these Native American women in the WCTU, who are Christian, who are pro-education, who are pro-Western style education, who are pro-incorporation in the broader white economy, at the same time, they are defensive of many elements of their tradition as well. And later on, she's actually also very fearful of allotment to non-Onondagas. And she mentions in some of the pieces that the WCTU publishes that if allotment happens on Onondaga, which they are successful at resisting, if allotment happens on Onondaga, then half the people living here who aren't Onondaga are going to get an allotment illegally. And so she was very fearful and resistant to allotment because she saw that what the problem would cause is a real breakup of the tribal community. And in fact, some of the people that she had problems with would probably end up with land. So that's how Eliza Pierce participated in the WCTU and then used it as as kind of part of her political strategy to navigate life. All right. Lydia Pierce is arguably more important. Now, when I say by more important, obviously we're all equally important human beings, but Lydia Pierce was an officer in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and she is going to have a much bigger effect outside of New York State because of her position and because of her activities. So a little bit about a background into her. Well, first and foremost, she actually becomes New York State Superintendent of Work Among Indians. And she's going to hold that role from 1914 until 1921. She passes away. And the reason that's important is that New York State had by far the biggest population in the United States and the biggest biggest membership from the WCTU. So if you are a Native American woman from New York State, you were connected into the apparatus. And a lot of those states that we associate with having large Native American populations, Arizona, New Mexico, California, a lot of the Native American communities there were quite isolated. But the women who were in New York State on reservations, they were a little closer to population centers and therefore kind of easier to reach and connect to. So Lydia Pierce gets a lot of kind of clout in the WCTU, and the WCTU higher leadership, the presidents, the national superintendent of work among Indians, will connect with Lydia Pierce a lot. So, who is she? Where does she come from? So, as I said, she's Onondaga, so she shares some of the same matriarchal traditions, clan membership, the idea of women who are clan mothers choosing the chiefs of the tribe and of the league itself. That's all part of her background as well. Now, she was Presbyterian, and I think she's Presbyterian her whole life. However, she is educated by the Quakers. And the Quakers had a boarding school, or it was actually a boarding school and day school on the Allegheny Reservation. It was called the Tunesasa School, sometimes called the Quaker School, which is it no longer exists, but it's on the banks. It was on the banks of the Allegheny River on the Allegheny Reservation. You actually can sort of go to where the site is, but some of it has been flooded with the Kinzua Dam. So she was educated by Quakers. Quakers had although not always temperance supporters, often had a close connection with temperance work. The Quakers also had a particularly good relationship with the Haudenosaunee. For those of you who've ever gone down to the Treaty of Canandaigua commemoration, which is in November of every year, the observers, that is the federal observers who were there to make sure that this was a fair treaty, were Quakers. So there's always somebody from the Quaker community representing them there at that commemoration. So she was educated by Quakers. She sent her children to the same school. She helped to found a kids club, it was a Loyal Temperance Legion, but it wasn't called that. But it was a children's temperance society not just on the reservation, but at the boarding school. Now she, although she's going to really get started as kind of an organizer in 1909. There is another Seneca reservation in western New York called the Cattaraugus Reservation. There's actually 4 technically. One is the Tonawanda Band of Senecas, which is its own independent nation with a different government than the Seneca Nation of Indians. Then there's Oil Spring Reservation, which has really no population. So Cattaraugus and Allegheny are the big ones. Cattaraugus had a WCTU that was organized earlier, but it was organized by white missionaries on the reservation. And they actually supported the members of that WCTU who were Native American women on the reservation. They actually encouraged the adoption of allotment in the 1890s, but overall the tribe's going to vote it down, and the Senecas are going to successfully resist allotment. But the WCTU on Cattaraugus was initially a supporter of it. So Lydia Pierce is an organizer, which means that it's her job to go to other communities and say, hey, have you ever thought about organizing a WCTU chapter? And here's the kinds of things that you do. So she would travel around all over New York State. She traveled to Cattaraugus, obviously. She traveled to Tonawanda. She traveled to the Tuscarora Nation up by Niagara Falls. So she traveled around quite a bit. She was not related to Eliza Pierce at all, and I don't think they were related in terms of any clan affiliation either, but they did know about each other. And I assume they probably met, but I didn't come across that in the record. All right. So how did she act kind of politically in a public sphere? And so here I have some one of the rules of PowerPoint is you should never read off a PowerPoint. But that said, she has some really interesting things to say. So I want to talk a little bit about what she does say, but I'm not just going to sit there and make you read it. I'm going to try to kind of emphasize some things. So in 1914, as she's becoming superintendent of work among Indians in New York State, at the Tunesasa Union, so this is the small local union that she started, she gives a speech supporting the Hobson Resolution. The Hobson Resolution was the congressional resolution that ultimately is going to become the 18th Amendment prohibiting alcohol. And the title of this was called A Saloonless Nation in 1920. So, she was pretty much on the money there. So she asked rhetorically, how are we going to get it passed? First by prayer, second by prayer, and third by prayer. So obviously indicating the importance of Christianity in the WCTU's work. But let us not think that by praying we shall have done our duty and wait idly for an answer. Let us work and join those who have banded themselves together to fight the liquor traffic by education, agitation, and organization. So this is reprinted in what's called the Union Signal, which is the national publication of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And so what you have here is a Native American woman who is calling for not just Native American women there, but also, because it becomes published, it's really a call to action for Native American everywhere to participate in this work of prohibition. But she's actually going to be invited, or she's going to take it upon herself to have more direct impact over Native American communities. All right, which we're going to get to in a second. However, how this fits in, although she's clearly a devout Christian and she's clearly interested in working within the U.S. political system because she adopts that language of agitate, educate, and legislate. She takes it to heart. However, I think there's some other things going on here in how the WCTU operated in Native American communities that made it attractive, particularly attractive to many Native American women, particularly those who come from matrilineal and matriarchal communities. So here we go. Here is a photo. And every now and then historians get incredibly lucky. And this is one of those instances. I have a friend of mine who works on kind of a similar topic. And one day she sends me an email, and there's an attachment, and this photo's to it. And she says, hey, I found this in the archives in California. And on the back it says, Western New York Indian Reservation, WCTU. Do you know anything about this? And I looked at the picture and I said, yeah, right there in the middle is our friend Lydia Pierce. And so I thought, wow, this is really cool. There's Lydia Pierce. And there's this great picture of all these women who are involved in the WCTU. And I, as historians do, like imagine Ken Burns, if you ever watched the Civil War or any of his documentaries, I started like going in and around and trying to make a story about what was in the picture. And I thought, you know what? There's something more than just a snapshot here. I think I'm really learning a little bit about why this would be so attractive to a Native American woman who's coming out of a matriarchal and matrilineal community. And so here goes. All right. So those loyal temperance legions, where the kids do their speeches and then they get a medal, that's what's going on in this picture here. Is what obviously happened is, and all we have is this picture. There's no story behind it other than the story we can read into this. But there's a couple things. First of all, there's no grown men in this picture. There are teenagers, this guy's probably a teenager. There are boys, and there are girls, and then there are women. Now, if you notice, the women all have on their dresses or jackets, they have a white ribbon, and the white ribbon is the symbol of the WCTU, which makes sense. What all the kids have on their jackets or dresses is a medal. And the medals are what you got for giving a particularly good speech. So you got up, you gave your talk on temperance or some reform movement, and if you won, you won a medal. And if it was, there were gold medal contests and silver medal contests, there were even diamond contests. And you'd memorize a speech and you'd deliver it. And so I started thinking about this in the context of Iroquois traditions. And I remember the motto of the Loyal Temperance Legion is, "Tremble, King Alcohol, for we shall grow up." And this was the idea that those boys are going to grow up and become men who are going to participate in suffrage and prohibition legislation in the political realm. But I started thinking about this in Native American communities. And one of the things that is so important in Haudenosaunee community is the oral tradition. So much so that today, Native American storytelling is an essential part. If you ever go down to Ganondagan to their summer festival or the winter games, there's always storytellers, and the ability to kind of mesmerize a crowd with both storytelling or in any kind of negotiation within the tribe, any kind of discussion within the tribe, there was there was very little ability to coerce people into doing what you wanted, so you had to persuade them with oratory. And this is all through Haudenosaunee culture, both today as well as in the historical period. And so I was thinking, wait a second, there's something big going on here with these the oral tradition and the LTLs, because this is what young men and ultimately young women are going to need to be able to do, is they're going to need to be able to speak publicly in their community, because that's something that is a traditional thing. Even as these young people may be growing up to be Christian and participate in the broader economy, at the same time, the oral tradition is an element that is going on. And I thought about it even further. And this is, for those of you who don't know, these are images from Ganondagan State Historic Site just south of here. And that's the Bark Longhouse, and that's the inside of the Longhouse. But I remember I was down there once, and someone was talking about the Iroquois tradition, whereby the clan mothers chose the men who would become the league chiefs, and they were talking about how they chose them. And this wasn't just a perfunctory thing, like, okay, it's it's Saturday, we got to go choose the league chiefs. It was a lifelong process whereby Native American women who were the clan mothers were actually watching little kids from the time they were little kids, right? Who were the ones that had the qualities that we want in a leader? Who were the ones that were able to refrain from violence against people? Who were the ones that treated women well? Who were the ones that were thoughtful? And so this idea of training and influencing and watching young boys as they grew to become men who would lead in the tribe was exactly what the WCTU was doing as well. And so I'm certainly not of the mind that the WCTU drew their idea from a matriarchal system, but what I do see here is a great deal of similarity and commonality that made the WCTU and the Loyal Temperance Legion in particular very attractive to women who were coming out of a matrilineal and matriarchal society. And so and again, there's more examples of this from throughout the country, where Native American women were very much promoters of the LTL, and they saw it as a way to influence young people on the temperance path from an early stage. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was so important to Native American women in the WCTU. Okay, so since I want to save some time for questions, what I'd like to do is talk just a little bit about how she kind of reached out across the country. That is how Lydia Pierce reached out across the country, and where we also see some elements of a tradition working into this temperance activity. So this is a pamphlet that's called "From an Indian to Indians," and it's published in 1915. Now, the text came from a speech that she gave to the Six Nations Temperance Society, which was actually a pan-Haudenosaunee organization that was really heavy on Tuscarora. It still exists today. It begins in the late 1820s, 1830s, and it continues to meet through the present day. So it was originally a speech to that organization, but then was reprinted. She reprinted it as a pamphlet and sent it out to South Dakota, to the Native American WCTUs on Indian reservations in South Dakota. So I want to just kind of walk you through some of the text here. All right, so she's she's kind of giving the laudatory part of her speech here. The Six Nations Temperance League is a great organization. It means a great deal to the Indians of this state. The tribes of the state of New York centuries ago banded themselves together for the purpose of defending themselves and their families from the tribes living to the south, north, and west of them, whom they took for their enemies. Now, this is a real summary of the creation of the Iroquois League. Then it was the old League of the Iroquois tribes against their neighboring foes, and afterwards, at their council fires in the old Longhouse, it became a temperance league to conquer their last and worst enemy. So obviously she's playing on the traditional oral tradition of the formation of the league to kind of bolster the temperance message. Now, again, for those of you who are interested in Haudenosaunee oral tradition and kind of values, one of the things that's emphasized is 7 generations. And I've heard this cast in 2 ways. One is that the 7 generation means that you need to think in terms of how something you do now is going to affect 7 generations in the future. And then I've heard it also said that you need to think about 7 generations and what they are going to need in the future, that they're going to need food, that they're going to need a language, that they're going to need a culture, that they're going to need access to medicine. And in either of those two kind of understandings, the generational thinking not just about our children, but several children down the road, is something that is embedded in Haudenosaunee culture. And here's this document. So I'm sorry to say that there are still some of our people who indulge in their use. These are leaving to their children, down to the 3rd and 4th generation, the evils that liquor brings on a nation. So in this, she's again echoing Haudenosaunee oral tradition in this speech, but then it's going to be kind of connected to the Native communities who are out in South Dakota. Here she's emphasizing, just kind of skipping to the last line here, the best thing then is to surround our children with better environment, give them a good education, teach them to be self-dependent and industrious. Again, that's that fitting into the broader American economy. To respect themselves, and above all, teach them the religion of Jesus Christ. She is, after all, Christian. This is the Woman's Christian Temperance Union. The word's in there for a reason. Now, at the end of that speech, when it becomes a pamphlet, she writes a few other words. And she says, these are the words of an Onondaga woman to her own Iroquois people. Y'all knew that. They have known the white race much longer than the Western Indians have, which is in large part true. That is, the Haudenosaunee, by this point, have had longer enduring contact with whites than the Lakota have. She sends greetings to the tribes of the West and bids you all work hard for prohibition. Now is your chance to strike a harder blow for our country and our race with your ballots than all the tomahawks of any time or race could ever do. She indulges in some of the stereotypes that other people were doing at the time in this. Now you can cast a ballot, a vote. You can help set the whole land free and make it safer for all races. Vote yes for prohibition. What the heck is she talking about? So here's what was going on in South Dakota at the time, and what she was doing with that pamphlet, and how she was using her position and her writing skills to try and influence people out west. So in 1890, remember, if you go back to that whole allotment thing, many of the reservations in North and South Dakota where allotment had happened, Native American men there did acquire the franchise since 1890. Now, during this time, the women of South Dakota were also fighting for the right to vote, and they were getting denied. So Native American men who took their allotment, who became farmers, who renounced their tribal commitments, those individuals got the right to vote, and that caused resentment among many white women toward Native American men who did have the right to vote. In 1916, there is an election. There's actually two big referenda that are on the ballot. One is for prohibition, and one is for women's suffrage. And in 1916, prohibition wins, and women's suffrage is denied. And so after 1916, 1917, the state of South Dakota has a prohibition law, but it does not have women's suffrage. So what then happens is white women in the Women's Christian Temperance Union are going to take out their resentment on Native American men in the press. But what was Lydia Pierce attempting to do? And we don't know to what extent she affected the election, but there was a full court press on Native American communities where men had the right to vote, that they should go out and vote for prohibition, and to a lesser extent suffrage, but there was a move to push Native American men in that direction, and that's what Lydia Pierce was doing with her pamphlet. One of the things I think that's fascinating is, while she's doing that and promoting Christianity, the Haudenosaunee oral tradition is right there in the text, kind of seamlessly woven into it. All right, so 1916, I said that white women were resentful of Native American men who got the right to vote. Here is Exhibit A. The book has Exhibits A through Z, if you will. So, but I just want to kind of talk about some of the limitations that the WCTU was an organization that was definitely reaching out to Native American women. Women were using the WCTU for both prohibition purposes, but also for political purposes, other kinds of political purposes. But that Native American women, or I'm sorry, white women in the organization were not necessarily as progressive as well they could have been, and certainly engaged in a great deal of racist language. So this is just one example. And here she's critiquing this whole idea that Native American men could vote before white women. And so this is there's no clear author. This is an anonymous editorial in the North Dakota White Ribbon, which is the state paper, so the state version of the Union Signal. The Indians never wanted suffrage, never asked for it, and they rarely use it except when some crafty politician gives a roast ox barbecue, smuggles in plenty of firewater, and weeks at gambling and debauchery. The liquor men have a plan on foot to give a series of these disgraceful feasts and get influential wet men to swing the Indians into line. Politics are beyond an Indian's ken, particularly when he is so slightly removed from savagery. And there you have it. This kind of language is all over the WCTU state and national papers as well, where while Native American women are trying to kind of find their place in the organization, they're often running into these kinds of biases and prejudices within the organization. Okay, so it's 2 o'clock now. Just kind of a couple little things here, and then I'll open it up to questions. Some of you in the audience may have heard about Matilda Jocelyn Gage. There's a regional historian, Sally Roche Wagner, who is the expert on Gage, and also makes a big argument about the early white feminists being very influenced by Haudenosaunee women, and so this is clearly kind of embedded in that, or is connected to that story. But one of the things I kind of explaining an absence here, I guess you will, because there is certainly a lot of overlap in the fact that were Native American women influencing white women? The answer to that is unequivocally yes, in a million different ways. But where is Gage in all this? Matilda Jocelyn Gage and Frances Willard did not like each other, and that may be putting it mildly. So this is from the Union Signal, 1890. This is them giving their report about what was going on in kind of a regional meeting. Extracts were also read from the Liberal Thinker. The Liberal Thinker was the magazine that was edited by Matilda Jocelyn Gage, saying, quote, that Miss Willard was the most dangerous woman in the United States, calling her Pope Willard, saying that she was using the WCTU for the union of church and state, and that we had gone far enough in the way Miss Willard and Senator Blair would lead us. Okay. Whoops. Got the best part. Now, in this dialogue, now this is obviously from 1888, so this occurred earlier, but Susan B. Anthony and Frances Willard, they were of different political affiliations in that Willard was very much supportive of the Prohibition Party. Susan B. Anthony was kind of a mainstream Republican reformer, or sought more mainstream Republican reforms. But Anthony, who was seeing a lot of the things that Gage was writing, as Gage became more radical and Susan B. Anthony kind of stayed a more conservative course in the move towards suffrage, Anthony writes this to Willard. The trouble with so many is that they can't see that so-called liberals are likely to become as bigoted and narrow as the bigots of the various religions of the past or present. So this is Susan B. Anthony writing to Willard, who was obviously a sympathetic ear, because you had Gage calling Willard the most dangerous woman in America, in large part because Gage was much more critical of the established churches than Willard was, who of course was leading a Christian temperance union. All right, so I want to stop there. I'll leave this up because some people might have questions. Well, what happens? Well, the 18th Amendment's passed, we get prohibition. The 19th Amendment's passed, we get women's suffrage. Native American women Native American women are still disenfranchised in large part because they don't have citizenship necessarily. And there's not going to be universal Native American citizenship until 1924 and the Snyder Act. And even after that, jumping 2 minutes here, jumping past that, even after the Snyder Act is passed, which grants universal citizenship to Native Americans, the states, much like they did with African Americans after the Civil War and into the 19th century, are going to enact specific pieces of legislation that are intended to curtail the Indian vote. New Mexico, Maine, Alaska, South Dakota, Utah, North Dakota, and Arizona are just a few that implement literacy tests. They refuse to put polling places on reservations, or they simply state, because states have a great deal of authority in determining voting laws, they simply state that as long as as long as Native Americans are wards of the federal government, they cannot vote. And those aren't going to be removed completely from states like Utah and Arizona and Maine until the 1960s. Still challenges today for Native Americans who attempt to vote. Voter ID laws and street address laws are ways that Native Americans are disenfranchised, because they often might not, if they live in a remote area, they might not have an acceptable ID. And street address laws, which say that you have to live on a street that has an address, which in suburban New York, or even on reservations in New York State, there tends to be street names. However, especially out west, there's a lot of reservations that have very remote places that don't have a road with a street address. And so people have mailboxes. And so attempts to curtail Indian voting continue. However, some good news here. We have 2 Native American women who are in Congress for the first time, Sharice Davis and Deb Haaland, 2 Democratic women who have been co-sponsors of the Native American Voting Rights Act. It has not been passed yet. It's in process, and there's a good chance it won't be signed. But nonetheless, there are continued challenges to Native American participation in voting, limits on citizenship, and at the same time, there are Native American leaders, Native American women in particular, who are leading the fight to preserve or encourage or protect Native American voting rights. And with that, I'd like to turn things over, if I can operate the Zoom here, switch things over from me to opening things up to questions. Gabriel, can you help me out here?
Anyone who would like to ask a question should just unmute themselves. Do we have any questions? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
It was very weird speaking into a PowerPoint there. I couldn't really see anybody's faces. So if anybody has any questions, comments, any other ideas, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Heather Lewis says no questions, but that was really interesting.
Thanks. That's Heather's from our math department.
We did have a question earlier. What
Yeah.
is an Indian agent? And I gave a very brief discussion, but maybe you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, official U.S. government agent allowed to work with tribes for their protection and following laws. Yeah, so Indian agents, what they literally are is an employee of the federal government, and it's very interesting. It's one of these things where we can talk about big federal Indian policy and what the laws are passed, but a lot of what happens on the reservation in terms of how it's implemented, whether it's abusive or not, comes down to the Indian agent in a community. And there were always attempts, that is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, obviously if it was led by a conscientious commissioner, they always tried to get sober, they often tried to get either ministers or people that were devout to work on reservations. But what you often got was in some of these federal employees, you got people who were shady, who might even be involved in alcohol trading themselves. One of the things the WCTU very much tried to do was try to get those people out. So there was there was a guy named William Pussyfoot Johnson. He was not he was a special agent to the Department of the Interior, and the WCTU really liked this guy. And what Johnson would do is he would actually go on to reservations and he would try to root out these kind of nefarious Indian agents. So it's a government employee that's on the reservation to implement federal Indian law, but who that person is, their ethics, their connection or knowledge or willingness to understand what was going on within the tribal community, all that would impact, what happened on the reservation. Yeah, and they're like any human being, they're of different they're of different qualities, I guess you could say. And some of them were shady, and some of them were tried to do the best job they could. But they were always an arm of the federal government.
So we have another question coming in from Caitlin. Thank you. Did doing this research influence your thinking about the importance of voting in a democratic country? Were there any notable democratic practices that emerged because of the refusal of the federal government to recognize Native Americans?
So I'm going to answer this question by saying something that I wanted to say in the talk that hopefully will get to this. So one of the things that's different about Native Americans and voting than, say, other minority communities, particularly African Americans who fought for a right to vote, and to a great extent women fighting for the right to vote in general, is that almost everybody in the African American community and women think of, like today in the 21st century, think of voting as a good thing. You should vote, you should participate, having the vote is important, voting is a duty of some kind, and generally that's how people view it. In Native American communities, one of the things that differentiates voting from those other communities is that by voting, you are admitting in a tacit way that you are part of the state or U.S. government that you may in fact reject. And so one of the things that happens after 1924, although Native Americans are trying, many Native Americans are saying, look, we got to go vote, we can participate in politics now, that's a good thing. Other people are saying, wait, this 1904 Citizenship Act, this is actually a violation of older treaties that indicate that we are an independent and sovereign nation. And so in the same way that I'm not going to get up and go vote in an election in Mexico, I'm not going to go get up and vote in an election in the United States, because that's essentially admitting that we're not a sovereign nation. And so that viewpoint among traditionalists, among people who just simply reject or want to highlight the treaty relationship, there's a rejection of voting that may occur also that's not because of an impediment, which is another problem, but it's in fact, it's a political move also to not vote, because we have our own tribal government and we're going to vote for that. And that's a different viewpoint than I think you see in other communities. Okay, so in terms of democratic practices that emerged because of the refusal of the federal government to recognize Native Americans, I think one of the things that, as I was preparing for this, and of course, as I prepared, I developed probably another hour presentation on individual states' restrictions on Native American voting. And I guess I was a little surprised, even though I do Native American history and have been doing it for a few years now, but the specific restrictions, how long they lasted, and how they got away with it and continue to get away with it. I guess I shouldn't be surprised in any way, shape, or form, but I found it to be compelling and motivating towards towards a variety of things, I guess I should say. Moving towards action, moving towards encouragement of Native American Voting Rights Act and other kind of initiatives like that, because clearly what you're doing is disenfranchising a population that is at the is at the bottom of most markers in terms of economics and poverty and those kinds of things. And so failing to give people access to a federal government that has a trust relationship with them is a one of the worst problems that I see. And so with the two women who are in Congress now, you saw immediately a list of laws introduced for protection of Native American women. You see, a protection of voting rights, which ideally in turn then lead to more legislation and more government officials, like we were talking about Indian agents. The old agency system doesn't exist in the same way anymore, but having Bureau of Indian Affairs officials that are not the shady kind, but are working within tribes in the 21st century term to promote self-determination with the tribe. Any way you cut off people from influencing that process is a horrendous thing. And I guess that's one of the things that I was left with is the continued problem and how pervasive it is.
So we have another question
Yep. Okay, church-run schools.
from Joanne, who says, when you spoke of the boarding schools that Native Americans were sent to, were they church-run schools? Do they still exist?
Okay, so there were all kinds of federal boarding schools. Some were run by churches. Some were run by independent operators of the federal government. They were given, through legislation. During the New Deal, there was also something called the Indian New Deal, and the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs was a guy named John Collier. And John Collier began the move to shift away from boarding schools and onto day schools on reservations. John Collier, although many elements of the Indian New Deal, especially the Indian Reorganization Act, which is going to encourage, it's going to end the allotment process and is going to promote attempts to reabsorb tribal communities or reconnect tribal communities. But one of the things it's going to do that's negative is it's going to, well, it's not negative, but it has a mixed legacy, is it's going to promote democratically elected governments that look like the broader local governments, state and local governments. And some people might say, hey, that's good, right? You have a local government, democracy's good. But what it was a challenge to was traditional tribal governments, which didn't necessarily have democracy, but might rely on inherited clans and other ways of choosing leaders. So John Collier, on the whole, however, definitely rolled back a lot of the most destructive forces. So there was a shift away from boarding schools, but the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, there's still Native American boarding schools. Today, I think there's 2 or 3. Chemawa in Oregon is one, but it's certainly much different than it was then. So what happens with boarding schools, or one of the problems with boarding schools, is there's a lot of activities. I mean, both scholarship from kind of in the academic sense, scholarship by indigenous people whose family members went there. One I think the most interesting ones is a book by Chanina Lomowaima called they called it Prairie Light, but there's certainly dozens and hundreds of them by scholars, either white or indigenous scholars. But there's also a lot of kind of healing going on. There's a lot of understanding of trauma and generational trauma that the boarding schools caused. And so that's kind of that's just because the boarding schools are kind of over as we know them, the legacy of them is tremendous. Because those people, when they went there, were kids. And so when they had kids and those kids have kids, that trauma continues on down the line as they raise children, etc. And so the boarding schools were, and they existed in other places too. They existed in Canada, and Canada has very similar kinds of issues with trauma. But they were run by different entities depending on where they were. But there were the big ones. They were either created by legislation. Some were run by churches or religious institutions, and they varied. Okay, so let's see. Native American women, would you estimate, were in favor of temperance in the WCTU and the schools? Okay, so the schools an attempt to Americanize the kid. I'll do that one first and then go back to the percentage. Absolutely. The schools were an attempt to Americanize children. What the goal was, and this is what many of you have heard this phrase before, but where it comes from was one of the founders of the Carlisle Indian School. What he was doing, what he did was he had actually been during the Civil War. He had seen the development of the Hampton Institute and other schools that were developed for African American freedmen. And he said, look, this is a good thing. This is a way that you take people who are impoverished and you teach them both kind of basic academic skills, but you also teach them farming, maybe a craft, or you know, well, you learn a trade like carpentry or butchering or those kinds of things. And this would be a way to incorporate people into the broader economy. So he saw this as a good thing for African Americans in the Deep South. And so then he applied it to Native American communities. And so we see the establishment of the Carlisle Indian School, and the motto was kill the Indian and save the man. And you've heard that, many of you may have heard that in other places. That's where it's specifically coming from. And so from his perspective, I mean, this was not George Armstrong Custer who wanted to go out there and kill individuals or other individuals who participated in outright murder. He thought what he was doing was a good thing. Now, the impact of this was you were taking Native American kids away from their communities, far away. Kids at Carlisle in Pennsylvania were coming from around the country, and they might not see their family for years. Those Indian agents, many of those Indian agents, they were involved with the taking of children without their permission. Again, sometimes thinking that they were really helping because the kids were going to be in a better situation at the boarding school. And then the boarding schools, what you had were epidemic diseases often, poor food, sexual violence, etc. And this, of course, takes place from coast to coast. And you have whole communities of Native American communities that are torn asunder by this practice. Now, the goal was that these are people that are going to go and learn a trade. They're going to learn how to become successful farmers. Some schools were organized to kind of promote leadership within the tribal community. They're going to go back and become leaders in their government. And instead of kind of bringing back shining stars into their communities, what you get instead are people who come back with a lot of wounds, and they often forget their traditional language and traditional practices, and they often are ostracized when they get home. So it really is a tremendous problem. A long-term problem of this attempt to Americanize was a big problem, or continues to be a big problem. In terms of the percentage of Native American women would you estimate were in favor of temperance and the WCTU? All right, great question here. So one of the things is it's very difficult to count, okay? So if you take some of the places where there were kind of Native American hotbeds in the WCTU, and eastern Oklahoma is one. It's probably a little easier in New York State because we know there were about 600 people living on the Onondaga Nation, and let's just say, Eliza Pierce estimates that there were a couple dozen people in the Union at one time. So you're talking, a very small percentage that's participating. Now that said, membership in one organization like the WCTU, that wasn't limiting. So you could be a member of the WCTU, the Six Nations Temperance Organization. There was another organization around called the Independent Order of Grand Templars. And you might join one organization, you might join them all, you might move between organizations. So a lot of times people move back and forth. And of course, we should also say that one of the kind of indigenous traditions and revitalization movements, Gaiweo, which is started by Handsome Lake, that is a very strong temperance message, which is not part of the kind of Christian movement. So there are indigenous movements as well that operate outside of kind of the broader white movements. So there's a lot of people who are involved in some kind of temperance message or another. Sometimes people move back and forth between organizations or between faith traditions, just like you might see in Christianity. Somebody might be born Methodist, then convert to Catholicism, and then decide later on in life they really like the Baptist Church. And so Native people move back and forth between between multiple different beliefs too, just like non-Native communities. Now the WCTU dips down after Prohibition, and especially after its repeal. The WCTU does a nosedive. So although the WCTU still exists today, and there are places where it's more prominent than others, actually Southern California, believe it or not, has one of the most active current WCTU unions. It's right in basically Koreatown in Los Angeles. It's the center of, it's probably the biggest WCTU operating today. But most of the WCTU unions really decline big time after Prohibition is repealed, and later it's going to be replaced by organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, DARE, other kinds of organizations that are doing similar kinds of things, but not necessarily seeking outright prohibition the way the WCTU was. So in terms of the numbers, probably pretty small, in fact, and in some communities it's almost non-existent. But there's hotbeds. The Creek community in Indian Territory. There's a lot of Creek women that are involved. There's a lot of Cherokee women who are involved, and it seems to ebb and flow depending on who the leader is. So there might be a lot of excitement for a period of time, and then it might die down. There might be a lot of excitement and joining when there's a big event going on, like a big piece of legislation that's about to come through, and then you see it decline. So there's a lot of fluctuation in the Native American community in the WCTU chapters. Other questions?
So no more questions? Okay, well, I've lost my video somehow, but this is Gabriel again. I'd like to thank Dr. Lappas for this very engaging presentation. Sounds like we all have a lot to learn about this, and your book will be a great place to get a lot of that education. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. This was enjoyable.
And I'd just like to remind everyone else, tune in next month for our next program, which is Vintage Tweets Suffrage Era Postcards, presented by Carol Crossid from the St. Anthony Birthplace Museum. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.